First of all, Mazal Tov to everyone tonight celebrating. And Shari, that was absolutely beautiful, stunning, really. And I'm not really sure what I could possibly add to that. I was told to make the Talmud more sort of relatable, but I'm pretty sure you did that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share screen right now just for a couple of minutes, and I'm just gonna give you a heads up because I know we're running a little bit late. I will probably in all likelihood not go through all of these sources inside, but I'm gonna sort of touch on them and I'll refer to them as I mention them, so feel free for your own edification just to keep them up. Are the words okay, Michelle? Can you see them or it's too small? You got it? Okay. So the Masechet that you're all making a Siyum on tonight really deals most prominently with the donations from the temple. But as I think Shari mentioned and Michelle mentioned as well, it addresses lots of other topics sort of in passing, as you know, the ADD reference over there made reference to. And one of the topics, really, it covers really a wide range of temple related issues. One of the topics that I wanted to focus on tonight in particular that's mentioned on Daf Tet Vav, which you have right there in your first sources, is one of the stories that I imagine many of you are familiar with regarding the whereabouts of the Aron, of the Ark. And we know that the Aron was used in the Mishkan and in the first temple, but we also know, and the Gemara mentions this actually in a couple of places, that it was not used in the second temple. And so there's some speculation as to what happened to the Aron. And according to the Gemara that you've all learned, the Aron was actually hidden away. Some believe that it was hidden away in the days of Yoshiyahu. And the Gemara there actually mentions the legend about the Kohen that notices that one of the floor tiles was slightly raised. And he understood somehow that the Aron must have been hidden underneath, but of course he was killed before he could reveal what he knew. As if to say, I would imagine, but of course, you know, again, I imagine many of you probably discussed this during your learning together, what that story is really implying. But I think on the most surface level, the Gemara or the Mishnah in that case seems to be telling us that the hiding place of the Aron is actually meant to be hidden. And so it goes without saying that, as with everything Jewish, right, there's lots of other theories as well as to where the Aron disappeared to. You have on your sources right over there, source 2, the pasuk that many people quote from the end of Divrei Hayamim, that talks about the fact, or sort of deduce from that pasuk that refers to the different kelim that were removed in the days of the Babylonians, that perhaps the Aron was taken out along with some of the other holy vessels. Actually, in the second book of Maccabees, you have that there also in your sources, source 3, which was written approximately 100 BC, but that's not really a great date, says that actually Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah the prophet, knowing that the temple was going to be destroyed, hid the ark along with other things in a cave on Har Nevo. And the second book of Maccabees really describes the scene. It's a fantastic scene. You should read it inside. And the scene that's described there has Yirmiyahu telling his followers that the place should remain hidden until the appointed time. Right? So of course, the second book of Maccabees was fodder for Indiana Jones, right? And there's no shortage of traditions. And there are people that believe that it ended up in Ethiopia. Some argue that there's a community in Yemen that argues that they know exactly where the Aron is. There are theories that it ended up down in Egypt. I guess, again, only Harrison Ford really can the teku will have to be done by Harrison Ford. But the question that I wanted to sort of put out there, and that I really think is worth asking, is why the obsession with knowing, right, where the Aron ended up, or with locating it. And just for sort of a point of comparison, we don't really have similar legends about the fate of the Shulchan or the Mizbach HaNechoshet. I think the only perhaps comparable example might be the menorah, but I think that really the obsession with the menorah comes more likely from the Arch of Titus, from the depiction of it in the Arch of Titus, from the destruction of the Second Temple. And so what I wanted to sort of just address tonight and maybe throw out there is, what is it about the Aron that couldn't be replicated in the Second Temple, right? All the other kelim were remade again, whether they were melted down the first time, whether they were stolen. The Aron, in contrast, is this thing that was created once in history, and it then takes up so much space in our collective imagination, right? And beyond that, by the way, it's the other thing we should sort of look at is why this, this preoccupation with the ark perhaps teaches us about the temple and about what it meant to Jews all those years ago. So I think that if we think about what the Aron really, it goes without saying, right? And I think this is sort of Muvan Me'elav, but it's something we always should just mention, that any discussion of our past, and certainly as it pertains to the discussions of the Mikdash, demand that we understand the broader historical and social context and really the world of which Israel was a part. And that means really that in order to understand what the Mikdash meant to ancient Israel, we need to understand what temples were and what they meant to people in the ancient world, more broadly speaking, because how human beings experience the world is something that's always changing. And so when the Torah was given to Am Yisrael, and Chazal say that it was given Kilshon B'nei Adam, right? It's given in the language of man. So it's not referring just to simply the language, right? It doesn't mean that the Torah was written in Hebrew. It's speaking really about the form that made sense to Israel, that the Tanakh or the Torah and the laws in the Torah were presented in a way that Israel could understand, using the standards, not just language, but symbols and associations of the world in which they live. And so, I always, I quote the Heilige Uncle Moishi. Okay, just by way of example, if we were to ever ask a child where Hashem is today, so most children that grew up, if they were lucky enough to grow up on Uncle Moishi tapes, would know Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, up, down, right, left, right? And one of the things that I speak with my students about a lot, really, because it's so important to understand, is that we are in a different place, Uncle Moishi and we, right? The collective modern Jew is in a very, very different place, theologically speaking, than Israel was in biblical times and where ancient Israel was coming from. Because in the ancient world, the truth is that there were, well, again, no Israelite would deny that God was transcendent, right? For example, but the focus when it came to ancient worship was actually God's immanence, was God's presence. And in the ancient world, temples were built because they were believed to be the abode or the dwelling place of the deity that was being worshipped. And ancient people all over the world believed that a deity, if a god, could be located in that space. So temples were about being able to locate God almost as a foundation or a prelude to worship. And you see this in a bunch of these psukim that I brought, even when Hashem talks about, when we look, for example, in source 4, right? We talk about the rebellion of the people in the desert. What they were asking in that pasuk there is, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin, is God in our midst, right? Very few modern Jews would say, is God in our midst? We may talk about how to connect to God. We may theorize about why bad things happen to good people, but this obsession with God being in our midst is something that was very, very real to the ancient Israelite. And even when God is speaking about the Makot, he says, L'man te'da ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz, that they should understand through the miracles of the 10 plagues that I am there. And when Hashem commands us to build a mikdash, he says, V'yasuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham, I will be literally in your midst. And we now know that really from Tanakh, that Hashem's presence was something that was both attractive and alluring, meaning it was something that people wanted to be close to. But at the same time, if you got too close, it could also be fatal, right? And I think perhaps the best example of this sort of dichotomous presentation of God's presence is seen actually by Har Sinai. And I'm keeping an eye on the time, so I'm not going to read through these psukim all inside, but please look here. You have in Sefer Shmot, you have the contrast there between the warnings before Har Sinai, before Matan Torah, when Hashem warns Moshe and he says, V'higbaltem, put all these barriers around the Har. The people are going to want to jump and touch the Har, but be really careful. They're going to want to come and approach me and come near the mountain, but you make sure you put those boundaries around the mountain lest they come near me because my presence is fatal. But then if you jump down to the very next parak, as soon as Bnei Israel, as soon as the people heard God's voice, they were terrified and they begged Moshe to replace Hashem. They were terrified of God's presence. And so there's sort of this cross when it comes to Hashem's presence between fascination and fear, and the synthesis of those two experiences. Right? And again, this is, sort of a discussion for a different time, but it makes sense then if you think through all the times in Tanakh where Hashem manifests, so to speak, when Hashem appears to Moshe for the first time, when Yeshayahu is describing in Perek Vav his impressions of God in the Mikdash, that Hashem manifests as fire. because it's something that mesmerizes, it's something that keeps us warm, but if we get too close, we're going to be burned. And so essentially what the Mikdash provided for Israel was a safe, controlled, carefully prescribed way to approach and worship God, where all the details of worship, and this is what you guys are going through daily, right? Learning through are all of the Pikayun rituals that they were carefully outlined. And in that way, Israel understood how to correctly and effectively worship Hashem. Right? And we don't have to even mention the infamous story of Nadav and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, that sort of stepped beyond the exact specifications of ritual and were incinerated on the spot by God's presence. And so going back to the Aaron, I think that one of the most distinguishing features between Israel and the other pagan nations. I said, Dibra Torah Kilshon B'nei Adam, that Israel was, by definition, a product of its ancient Near Eastern environment. But at the same time, it also goes without saying that the Torah, the revolution, the monotheistic revolution as articulated by the Torah, also made sure that the temple was distinct, that the temple was unique in lots of different ways. And so I would say one of the most distinguishing features between Israel and the other pagan nations that surrounded it was the fact that we alone didn't have any physical representation of Hashem, right? We're an aniconic religion. So we too built a temple, v'shachanti betocham, so Hashem can dwell in our midst, but we didn't have any physical representation. We were, in all likelihood, the only temple in the entire ancient Near East without a statue, without an idol inside. That being said, the actual space in which Hashem is believed to sit, or perhaps we might say the throne of God, was represented by none other than the Aron. And you have a couple of these sources on your sheets, and I actually realized as I was skimming through that I forgot to put the most important pasuk, which the epithet that when we refer to God, we call Hashem, one of the epithets that we use for God in Tanakh is Hashem Yoshev HaKruvim, that Hashem sat on the Aron. Hashem sort of manifested and appeared on the Aron. The Luchot were stored inside, but Hashem appeared with the Aron. And if you look, for example, even when Shlomo HaMelech built the Beit HaMikdash, so as soon as the Aron was moved into the Kodesh Kodashim, it filled up with that anan, with that smoke. And from that moment on, it says in Parak Chet in Sefer Melachim, no one was there then allowed to enter the Mikdash because it was understood to be sort of imbued with God's presence, which again, as we learned from Matan Torah, we can't get too close to. Okay, it's also not a coincidence. The famous pasuk we say every time we open the Aron in Shul, Vayihi bin Soah ha'Aron, right? Whenever the ark traveled, so the enemies in front of us scattered. The Aron was understood almost as the footstool or the palanquin of God. And so the famous story some of you might be familiar with in Shmuel, where they went out to war and took the Aron with us out to war, and the Plishtim were terrified and fled. And then, of course, unfortunately, the Aron was captured. But again, all of those narratives there are speaking towards this conception of the Aron as literally the throne of Hashem, and the belief that Hashem is in their presence if the Aron is there. And I think all of that helps us sort of understand why the Aron, more than any of the other vestments, more than any of the other Klei Mikdash, remains such a focus over the millennia, because they really represented so much in Israelite thought. But Shari, you inspired all of us, I think, to sort of think beyond, right, just what's written on the page, and to really address, at least what I understood from your words was, that there's so much more underneath, and it's not just about learning what happened, but it's about understanding. I think what we're all searching for when we learn Torah, whether it's Tanakh, whether it's Gemara, is that what we want to understand is not just what something meant for our ancestors, but at the end of the day, consciously or unconsciously, we're searching for meaning that's relevant to us, right? In our changed world, in a world that no longer looks like the world in which the Torah was given or the temple stood. And at the end of the day, we also want to know how the concepts that we're learning are relevant to our modern lived religious experience. And I think that the Aron, or the Mikdash and the halachot surrounding it, is actually one of the most amazing examples of how historical contingencies and the genius of our ancestors sort of come into play. Because if we actually look back at our temple's history, what we notice is that the conceptions of the Mikdash and God's presence as it relates to the Mikdash were never static. And they've actually been evolving over the course of the millennia of Jewish history. And the first major shift, I don't have to tell any of you, took place it goes without saying, after the first destruction, right? And in the ancient world, and you have a great picture here that's actually from Assyria. There you go, sorry, my apologies. It's an Assyrian relief, and it's not depicting the destruction of the temple, but it's an Assyrian relief from the 8th century BCE. And so it's depicting really how in the ancient world, what destructions of temples were understood to be. They were understood to be destroying the house of the deity, which meant that that deity had been defeated. And so if you see there, they're carrying out actually the idols themselves, as if to say, your God has been defeated. And so after the first temple was destroyed, right, Israel had to sort of wrap their minds around the concept that the place that once housed their God had been completely destroyed. And so theologically, they talked about God as universal and God as bringing the destruction as a punishment for us. Right? It's not that God had been defeated. It actually proves God's strength that the temple was destroyed because God said it was going to be destroyed. And beyond that, one of the things that we begin to see, and you have it here in your pasuk from Yirmiyahu, is an increased focus on the words of Yirmiyahu that spoke to God's strength as being indicated through the destruction. And then beyond that, also as a universal God, as a God that could hear tefillot from wherever they're uttered. Right? Now, again, the Torah always spoke of God as universal, but that way of imagining him was eclipsed for years by the image of him inside the temple. And so once the temple was destroyed, the focus of God as universal, as not needing one specific place, as I could stand in my place in Bavel and daven towards the Mikdash, and Hashem will hear me anyway, even if I'm not physically there, was something that was really, really important. It's almost as if the Beit HaMikdash began to exert in the Second Temple period this centripetal pull on the Jews that existed throughout the diasporas. And so we have, for the first time in Tanakh ever, Daniel davening towards Yerushalayim, which was almost unheard of. But it was really then, it goes without saying, and with this I'll sort of close, that after the destruction of the Second Temple and the final complete destruction of Jerusalem after the Bar Kokhba rebellions, that, like you were saying, Shari, our rabbis understood that the challenge that faced them was the challenge to imagine a centerless Judaism, and a Judaism that centered towards which everything was directed is lost. And so what the rabbis ingeniously understood is what they needed to do was create a Judaism that revered the temple, but, and I don't remember Shari or if you or Michelle mentioned this, I think Michelle did, in terms of the tefillot, the 3 tefillot, that on the one hand to revere the temple and then to build on the concepts of temple in a way that could infuse a temple-less world with ways of attaining closeness to God and with the same effects that temple ritual provided. And so they created, and what you're going to be started learning and what you'll continue learning for, till you hit that 7.5-year mark and then beyond, is that what you're really looking at in the Mishnah and the Gemara is the outlines of a portable, cohesive religion in the absence of temple, that at the same time was understood to be not necessarily novel, right? But a continuation of the temple that was. And so if we look at the halachot that are constituted by the Tanaim and the Amoraim that you're going to be learning about over the course of Daf Yomi. So we see, as I mentioned, the davening 3 times a day, keneged the korbanot. And what Chazal are saying is that, again, while there are no longer animal sacrifices on the altar, there's an alternative to sacrifice. There's a different way of accomplishing what the ritual of sacrifice accomplished. We know that the halachot regarding proper conduct in shul are based on the notion that a shul needs to be treated like a mikdash ma'at, like a mini temple, a place where we are reverent and aware what it means to be inside a hallowed space. Right? Chazal say that if you're learning Torah and doing mitzvot, so there are behaviors that actually attract the Shekhinah. If 3 people are sitting together and learning, just like we are all now, so the divine presence, it says Shekhinah shora beinehem, that the divine presence is in our midst. And so I imagine that as you learn through Shekalim, one of the things that you realize is that the rules, really speaking about donations to the temple, were never about donations, right? The rules, and Michelle, you definitely mentioned this, certainly the Agadot interspersed, explore things like human nature, like human connection to ritual, like greed and kindness, because the Gemara is so much more than just dry rules or just memories of what was. right? It's almost as if we might say that the ongoing search for the Aron that the Gemara intimates, right? Sort of talking about how it's hidden. And so it sort of piques our interest and we're always searching. I think it's more than just about finding that gold box. I think that on some level, if I could, maybe read into this Mishnah a tiny bit, I think on some level, Chazal there are speaking about this ongoing search, about the ongoing yearning, the striving for that closeness, for that feeling of imminence, that the placement of the Aron in the Kodesh Kodashim guaranteed. And so in many ways, while the Mishnah and the Gemara speak about the details of the Mikdash that was, what follows throughout Shas are all the myriad of ways to reconstruct, not just physically, but spiritually speaking, that closeness, that very real sense that the God of the universe is here, that the halachot outline our lives, essentially identify those ways in which we can perform rituals and accomplish ultimately what the Aron meant for ancient Israel. They teach us how to build a life that befits God's presence, both on the personal, but perhaps more importantly, even on the communal level. So I just wanted to say, if I was not in awe of each and every one of you already every day, I certainly am now after being able to sort of just participate in this tiny little slice of what you guys are so dedicated to do. And I just wanted to wish you luck on this amazing adventure. Remind you to keep an eye out, not for just what's being said on the surface of the daf, but as Shari mentioned, for those ways in which Chazal use these ancient and antiquated halachot to infuse meaning in our lives and to infuse understanding. And then beyond everything else, really just the tools that we can draw from to connect that much more deeply to God and to our community and to the, I guess what we would call the entire holistic religious experience. So thank you really again for this opportunity to be a tiny, tiny piece of this amazing journey, and good luck and mazal tov to everyone tonight.